The induction room at Sterling Capital Group smelled of new carpet. 12 of us had taken our seats that Tuesday morning, name badges clipped, polite expressions in place. I had chosen a seat in the middle, not the front, where eagerness looks desperate, and not the back, where it reads as contempt. My name is Vera Ashton. 34 years old. 8 years in corporate investment strategy, the last 2 in New York before I returned to London. Dark trousers, a cream blouse. Professional. Deliberate. Gillian Frost, the human resources manager, moved through her slides with practiced weariness, then stopped and looked directly at me. I see we have someone who perhaps did not read our appearance policy before arriving, she said clearly. We do maintain standards here. Laughter moved through the room. Not loud. Not kind. A viewer named Abby asked me recently, has anyone ever tried to humiliate you in a room full of strangers and lived to regret it? Abby, this story is your answer. My expression did not change. I smiled even, but something tightened in my chest that I recognized, not embarrassment. Something colder. Then a voice from the end of the row dropped into the dying laughter. You won't last a week here. I turned. Rupert Sterling, son of Chief Executive Bernard Sterling, leaned back with the ease of someone who had never once questioned his right to any room. He looked at me as though I were already forgotten. I unclipped my badge. Set it on the table. I won't, I said. And I walked out. The corridor outside was empty. My heels made almost no sound on the polished floor. I did not look back, but my hands were shaking. Not from fear, from restraint. From the very particular effort of leaving calmly when every instinct insists you say far more than 2 words. There is a discipline to silence. That morning, it cost me considerably. Behind me, the induction room was already recovering. I heard laughter, the relieved kind that fills a space once tension has been removed. I had been the tension. I had removed myself. As I turned towards the lifts, a voice reached me. A woman's, one of the other new starters, I suspected. She couldn't handle the pressure, she said. On day 1, I paused at the lift button. Pressed it. Waited. If only any of them, Gillian Frost with her barely contained satisfaction, Rupert Sterling with his easy smirk, the 12 strangers who had laughed along, had any understanding of who had just walked out of that room. If only someone had read the governance documents that my solicitor had been finalizing for the past 3 weeks. But they had not. That was precisely the point. The lift arrived. I stepped inside. The doors closed on their voices, and I exhaled, perhaps for the first time since I had sat down that morning. Ground floor. Lobby, then out into the cool morning air of Calendar Street. Whatever came next was already in motion. I had not started it. But I was the only one who understood exactly where it was going. I was crossing the lobby when my phone rang. Martin Hale. My solicitor. I answered without slowing my pace. Vera. His voice was careful, the tone he reserved for significant developments. I've just received a notification. Your employment record has been flagged for voluntary resignation this morning. Is that correct? Yes, I said. A silence followed. The kind that carries weight. You understand what this triggers, he said at last. I had been thinking about it since I reached the corridor. Yes, I understood completely. Under the terms of the Ashton Family Investment Trust, established by my late mother, Constance Ashton, 12 years before her death, any formal employment between Sterling Capital Group and me triggered a mandatory review of ownership disclosure. I had joined with the intention of keeping my position quiet for 6 months while I assessed the company from within. That plan was finished. It accelerates the disclosure timeline, I said. To immediate effect, Martin confirmed. Sterling Capital Group will be formally notified that their majority shareholder is no longer in their employment within the next few hours. I pushed through the heavy glass door of the building. Calendar Street was gray and entirely indifferent to what I had just set in motion. How much does the board currently know? I asked. Almost nothing, Martin said. They are about to learn everything. I stood still on the pavement. 62%. My mother had spent 16 years building it, share by careful share, through 2 financial downturns and 3 structural reorganizations. She had never needed to announce it. She had simply held it. Until now, so had I. I pieced together what happened upstairs from 2 accounts, one from Martin through his legal contacts, and one from my former colleague Beatrice Lund, who had joined Sterling Capital Group 3 months earlier and gave me a full account over coffee several days later. It was almost difficult to believe. But I knew those people, and I believed every word. After I left, the induction continued without disruption. Gillian Frost moved through her remaining slides with visible ease. Rupert had already departed, he rarely attended full sessions, and the 11 remaining new starters carried on as though nothing of consequence had occurred. 43 minutes later, Howard Bale appeared at the door. Howard was the finance director, a composed, methodical man of about 60, not given to visible emotion. He was visibly emotional. "Where is she?" he said. Gillian looked up. "I'm sorry?" "Vera Ashton. The woman who resigned this morning. Where did she go?" Gillian's expression moved from confusion to cautious authority. "She left. She resigned mid-session. Her conduct was quite—" "I know she resigned," Howard said. "I need to know where she went." "Why on earth does that matter?" Gillian asked. The room had gone completely still. 11 new employees watched as Howard Bale looked at Gillian Frost with an expression containing, in equal measure, genuine alarm and the first stirrings of fury. "Because," he said quietly, "she owns 62% of this company." The silence that followed was, by all accounts, complete. Rupert Sterling was called into his father's office at 11:47 that same morning. He told me this himself, much later, once the arrogance had largely left him and he was attempting, quite clumsily, to understand where everything had gone wrong. He had walked in casually, jacket on, coffee in hand, expecting a routine briefing. Bernard Sterling sat behind his desk, but he was not alone. Howard Bale stood at the window. 2 members of the legal team occupied chairs along the far wall. Nobody smiled when Rupert entered. "Close the door," his father said. Rupert closed it. "The woman from this morning's induction," Bernard said. "Vera Ashton. What exactly did you say to her?" Rupert set his coffee down. "I told her she wouldn't last a week. She looked completely out of her depth, she couldn't manage one comment from HR without simply getting up and—" "She resigned," Bernard said. "Yes, which rather proves my—" "Rupert." His father's voice was completely flat. "She owns 62% of Sterling Capital Group." Rupert laughed once, short, reflexive, the laugh of someone who believes they have misheard. Then he looked at the legal team, then at Howard Bale. Then back to his father. Not one face moved. "What do you mean she owns?" "Through the Ashton Family Investment Trust," the senior solicitor said. "The majority holding has existed for 16 years. Rupert sat down slowly. For the first time that morning, perhaps for quite some time, he had absolutely nothing to say. "My mother's name was Constance Ashton. She was not famous in the conventional sense and preferred it that way. What she was, throughout her professional life, was an extraordinary patient investor. She had met the original founder of what was then a small financial consultancy, Edmund Sterling, Bernard's father, at an investment conference early in her career. She had identified something in the company's structure that others had overlooked, and she began quietly and consistently acquiring shares over 16 years. By the time Bernard Sterling took over as chief executive, my mother held the majority stake. She had never exercised that position aggressively, she was content to allow professional management to run operations while her trust held its ground and grew. The power was always present. She simply never needed to use it loudly. She died 2 years before that Tuesday morning, and everything transferred to me. I had known about the ownership since my mid-20s. But it was only after I returned from New York that I decided to understand the company properly, not through financial reports and trustee meetings, but from the inside. I wanted to see with my own eyes how it operated and what kind of people ran it day to day. I had my answer within the first hour of walking through the door. That evening, as news of my resignation moved through the legal channels, emergency board meetings were called. Without the majority shareholders' cooperation, not one major resolution could legally pass. They needed me. I was nowhere to be found. I turned my phone to silent that afternoon and sat at the kitchen table in my flat in Finch Lane with a pot of tea and a novel I had not opened in 3 months. I managed 11 pages before I set it aside and simply stared at the wall. Martin had warned me that the resignation's legal implications would reach the financial press within 24 hours. He was right. By the following morning, a brief item appeared in a financial trade publication. The headline was cautious. The comment threads beneath it were not. By midday, the company's share price had dropped 11%. By mid-afternoon, a further 9%. I watched the figures on my tablet from the balcony with a cold pot of tea beside me. I felt a complicated assortment of things sitting together uncomfortably, a distant satisfaction that I was not entirely at ease with, genuine concern for the staff who had no part in what had happened, and beneath it all, an exhaustion I had not allowed myself to acknowledge until now. I had spent 18 months planning a careful, quiet entry into this company. I had spent 8 years building expertise that would make my presence credible on its own terms, independent of any trust document. I had not wanted my ownership to be the reason anyone took me seriously. Instead, it had become the only thing that mattered. My phone lit up on the table. Unknown number. Then again. Then again. I did not answer. The calls came in waves. Martin managed most of them. Bernard Sterling's office rang 4 times on the first afternoon. Howard Bale called twice. The external legal team left 3 voicemail messages. A formal letter arrived by courier, which I noted with interest, since courier delivery suggested an urgency they were struggling to express through ordinary channels. I did not respond to any of it. On the second evening, a text arrived from an unrecognized number. We need to fix this. Immediately. Bernard Sterling. I found that I was smiling. Not with triumph, with recognition. This was how it always worked. When something you hold quietly becomes suddenly visible and necessary to someone else, the entire tone of their communication shifts. Condescension evaporates. Assumptions dissolve. Couriers appear. 1 week ago, I could have walked into that building and been assessed by the cut of my hem. I had been publicly corrected by a human resources manager who had not taken the time to learn my name before doing so. A man who had inherited his confidence alongside his surname had told 11 witnesses I would not survive a week. Now Bernard Sterling was sending text messages at 8:30 in the evening. We need to fix this. Immediately. I put the phone face down on the kitchen table and stood there for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Now, I thought, they wanted to talk. They could continue wanting that for a little while longer. I was not in any hurry whatsoever. In the evenings that followed, I returned again and again to those first 45 minutes in the induction room, not only with anger, though the anger was present and I did not pretend otherwise, but with something more analytical. I wanted to understand precisely what had happened. Gillian Frost had not singled me out because my appearance was genuinely inappropriate. I had worn tailored trousers. Her comment had used institutional language as a personal instrument, vague enough to be deniable, pointed enough to land. She had looked across the room and identified someone she could establish a hierarchy over. The process took her less than a minute. Rupert Sterling had not spoken because he had assessed me and found me lacking. He had spoken because that was how he established his position in any gathering. He had not looked at my credentials or history. He had looked at me, a woman, unfamiliar, sitting quietly, and reached immediately for dominance. It was a habit. Possibly one he had never had reason to examine. What hurt most, sitting with it honestly, was not the humiliation itself. I had survived worse. What stung was realizing this had nothing to do with me personally. They had not specifically targeted Vera Ashton. They had simply behaved the way they always behaved with whoever happened to be in front of them. That was what I kept returning to in the quiet of Finch Lane. It was never about me. It was about how they treated everyone. That distinction would matter enormously before long. Martin telephoned on the fourth morning. The situation is deteriorating faster than their board anticipated, he said. They cannot ratify the quarterly budget without majority shareholder approval. 3 contracts are suspended in legal uncertainty. A supplier agreement worth approximately £8 million has been placed on hold. The counterparty solicitors have cited governance concerns. How are the staff responding? I asked. A pause. 2 senior members of the investment team have resigned quietly. I understand others are considering it. I was standing at my kitchen window, watching the ordinary grey morning in Finch Lane below. Approval chains have broken down throughout the senior tiers, Martin continued. Nobody above a certain level is prepared to sign off on decisions without board ratification. Board ratification requires you. They cannot replace you, cannot override you through any legitimate mechanism, and apparently cannot reach you. They have my contact details. They do, he agreed, with the faint dry edge that was as close to humor as Martin ever came. What they do not have is your cooperation. Those are 2 very different things. I thought about the 11 people who had remained in that induction room and returned to their desks without incident. I thought about the departments full of staff who had joined in good faith and worked conscientiously. None of them had been in that room. None of them had laughed. How long can they sustain this? I asked. Martin considered for a moment. 1 week, he said. Perhaps slightly less. They came to my home on the 6th day. I was reading when the intercom sounded. Not expecting anyone, I almost let it pass. Then it rang again. I crossed the room and pressed the button. Miss Ashton. Howard Bale's voice, stripped of its boardroom authority, careful, almost tentative. I am here with 2 non-executive board members. We would very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, if you are willing. A moment passed before I replied. Come up, I said. They arrived in good suits and with expressions I had never seen on any of them before. Howard was visibly exhausted in the way of someone who had not slept properly since making a significant error. The 2 non-executive directors, Philippa Mensah and Desmond Achebe, were composed but strained in ways their composure could not fully conceal. I offered them seats. I did not offer tea. I let a moment of quiet pass before anyone spoke. We made a serious mistake, Howard said. The board acknowledges this unreservedly. What occurred during the induction, the public comment, and what was said to you afterwards, was entirely unacceptable. We should have been aware of the situation before it reached this point. I let the silence settle between his last word and my response. Long enough to be felt. Not so long as to seem theatrical. Yes, I said. You did. Then I waited, and let them understand that I was not going to make what came next straightforward for any of them. I had spent 3 evenings preparing the document I now placed on the coffee table in front of them. Not in anger. Not in haste. The document was precise, clearly structured, and I had made absolutely certain of this, legally watertight. Martin had reviewed every clause twice. I had reviewed it again myself. There would be no ambiguity and no room for creative reinterpretation later. Howard leaned forward and began reading. His expression moved through the first page with studied composure. By the second page, it had gone very still. He passed it to Philippa, who read with her chin raised slightly. Desmond read at last, in silence. This is quite extensive, Howard said. Yes, I said. The document contained 5 conditions. Full operational oversight, including the right to review and veto any senior appointment. The removal of Rupert Sterling from his leadership position was managed discreetly but completed within 30 days. An independently commissioned cultural review, with findings shared with all staff. A formal public acknowledgement, not an internal note, but a published statement, that my resignation had been triggered by conduct falling below acceptable professional standards. and a restructured role that reflected my actual position in the organization. I leaned back in my chair. "Take as long as you need to consider it," I said pleasantly, "or I remain resigned and we proceed through the trust's legal structure. The choice belongs entirely to you." They exchanged one long, carefully measured look. Then Howard reached for his pen. They had telephoned Rupert before coming to see me. I discovered this later through Philippa, who became a quietly reliable presence over the months that followed. He had apparently argued against negotiation at considerable length. He had used the word capitulate. He had suggested the board was surrendering authority unnecessarily. Nobody had agreed with him. He appeared at my flat 2 hours after the others had left, uninvited, which I noted, and defensive in the particular way of people who have discovered, for the first time, that they are not the most important person in a situation. I opened the door, considered him briefly, and stepped back. He stood in the middle of my sitting room rather than sitting down. I suspected it was a deliberate choice that had not landed as intended. "I want to be clear," he began, "that I had absolutely no knowledge of your—" "I know," I said, "and what I said during the induction, it was simply a comment, it wasn't intended to." I stopped him with a single quiet sentence. "You embarrassed me publicly in front of 11 strangers," I said. "Now you will understand privately what that costs." The room went completely still. For the first time since I had watched him leaning back in that chair with such comfortable ease, Rupert Sterling looked genuinely small, not diminished by circumstance alone, but small from something beginning to reach him from the inside. He left without another word. The formal signatures arrived 4 days later. A full board session was convened, Bernard Sterling himself present, which I was told he had resisted before ultimately accepting. I did not attend in person. Martin represented me throughout. Every condition in the document was read aloud into the official record and put to a formal vote. The vote was unanimous. Martin telephoned me immediately after the session closed. "They've signed," he said, with no flourish. He understood this was not the moment for any. All 5 conditions agreed. Rupert's transition commences next week. The cultural review firm has been engaged. The public statement issues on Friday morning. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing financial reports he had sent the previous evening. I set them aside. "Thank you," I said. "How do you feel?" he asked, an unusual question from Martin. I considered it genuinely before answering. "Not victorious," I said. "That is the honest answer. I feel that something has been corrected. That is quite different from winning." Martin was quiet for a moment. "What happens now?" "I go back," I said. But not as the person who left. That distinction mattered more than anything else I could have said. I was not returning to reclaim a position or restore a previous state of affairs. I was returning with a different quality of authority, not the authority of a job title or a trust document, but the authority of someone who had been tested and had not yielded. Someone who had converted a moment of intended humiliation into something structural. I was not simply back. I was in control. My first week back was almost entirely quiet, which was precisely what I had intended. I had a corner office on the 5th floor, as specified in the agreed terms. I arranged no formal announcement and held no re-entry meeting. I simply arrived on a Monday morning at 8:30, sat down, and began working through the operational reports waiting in my inbox. People noticed. Of course they did. But I had learned over 8 years in this industry that the most effective statement you can make in a professional environment is not a confrontation or a declaration. It is competence, conducted calmly, consistently, and in full view of everyone. Let the work speak first, allow everything else to follow. By midweek, the effects were already visible. Approval chains that had been paralyzed for 10 days began moving again. Supplier agreements were confirmed and signed. The quarterly budget ratification was processed within 48 hours of my return. Rupert's transition had already begun, implemented with a subtlety I found entirely appropriate. His responsibilities were redistributed across other divisions. His title was adjusted. His office was relocated to the 3rd floor. No announcements were made. No scenes occurred. He did not make a scene. Perhaps he had finally understood that scenes were no longer available to him in the way they once had been. Within a fortnight, everyone in the building felt the change without being told. The corridors were the same. The meeting rooms were the same. The people were the same. But the weight of authority had moved, quietly and completely, and not one person needed it explained to them. The cultural review commenced in my third week back. I had engaged Northfield Advisory, an independent firm with no prior connection to Sterling Capital Group and no stake in a favorable outcome. Their brief was straightforward: assess the management culture, identify patterns of systemic bias or suppression of professional potential, and report findings without softening the language. The report they returned 6 weeks later was not easy to read. Not because it was surprising, because it was thorough. What it documented, in measured professional language, was a pattern I had suspected from the moment Gillian Frost had looked across that induction room and decided to make an example of someone she had never met. Subjective conduct assessments applied inconsistently across gender lines. Informal leadership cultures that valued proximity to senior management above measurable performance. A complaints process that existed in policy documents but had a documented history of outcomes that could most generously be described as discouraging to those who used it. I had not been the target of something unusual. I had been the recipient of something entirely ordinary. 37 members of staff had submitted anonymous testimonies. Several described incidents spanning years. Some had left roles they were well suited to because the environment had made advancement feel impossible. I read every single submission. I sat with the report for 2 full days before taking action. I had arrived believing a 62% shareholding made me powerful. The report taught me something more important. Real power meant having the ability to make things different for people who held no stake at all. That was where everything shifted. I called the board together 3 weeks after the Northfield report had been distributed to all members. I had given them time deliberately. I wanted their responses to come from genuine reflection rather than the discomfort of being handed difficult material minutes before a meeting. When people are given real time with uncomfortable truths, they tend to move through several stages: denial, then rationalization, and then, occasionally, something that approaches honest acknowledgement. Several of them had reached that third stage by the time they sat across from me. I would like to establish a permanent internal division, I said. It will operate independently of human resources and report directly to my office. Its mandate will cover leadership accountability, transparent performance evaluation, and the protection of employees who raise conduct concerns. Philippa Mensa nodded immediately, without hesitation. Howard Bale studied the table for a moment. This falls outside our standard organizational structure, he said. Yes, I agreed. It does. Deliberately. The operational costs are accommodated within the existing restructuring provisions. Martin has verified the figures thoroughly and they are sound. Desmond Achebe leaned forward. What will you call it? I had given this considerable thought over the previous week and had arrived at an answer I felt entirely certain of. The Constance Division, I said. Named after my mother, who invested in this company for 16 years because she believed it had the genuine capacity to become something excellent. I intend to demonstrate that her belief was correct. Not one board member raised an objection. The motion passed. 6 weeks after my return, Sterling Capital Group published a formal public statement. Martin and I had worked on it across several evenings. It was not defensive. It did not bury the significant information beneath layers of corporate language. It stated plainly that conduct during a recent employee induction had fallen below the company's declared standards, that those responsible had been identified and appropriate action taken, and that a comprehensive cultural review had produced substantive structural reform across management and operations throughout the organization. The press coverage that followed was more extensive than I had anticipated. The headline that spread most widely was not one I would have chosen, but it was accurate. Sterling Capital Group majority shareholder resigns on day 1, returns to overhaul company from within. Within 48 hours, the framing shifted from scandal to something more considered. Profiles appeared discussing the Constance division and its mandate. An interview request came from a financial journal I had been reading since early in my career. I accepted it, gave a measured account, and ensured the conversation remained focused on structural changes rather than individuals. Within a fortnight, the share price had recovered and then surpassed its pre-crisis level. More significant to me was a different figure. In the first month after the Constance division's launch, 43 anonymous staff submissions arrived through the new internal reporting channel. People were beginning to believe the process was real, that submitting a concern would lead somewhere. That was the beginning of something worth building carefully. Rupert Sterling requested a meeting with me 8 months after that first Tuesday morning. He sent the request through the formal scheduling system, which I noticed. He could have knocked on my office door, but he booked a standard slot, just as any member of staff would. I found that meaningful. I accepted. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon and sat properly in the chair across from my desk, not attempting to take up the space. His hands rested on his knees. He had the expression of someone who had spent several months in a private reckoning with himself that had not been comfortable. I had been thinking about what you said, he began. That I embarrassed you publicly and would learn privately what it cost. He paused. I understand now what you meant. Do you? I said. I did not try to understand who you were, he said. I did not try to understand anyone in that room. I arrived with a conclusion already formed and looked only for confirmation of it. I studied him. He was not performing contrition for an audience. There was no performance available here, and he knew it. That mattered considerably. Growth is not guaranteed, I said. But it is possible. A quiet settled between us. Then, carefully, is there a version of this where I become someone different? I thought of the Constance division. Of 37 testimonies. Of 43 people using the new system because they finally believed it was real. That depends entirely on whether you mean it, I said quietly. And on what you choose to do next. 1 year after walking out of that induction room, I stood in the same building, the same space where everything began. The room had been refurbished, but the dimensions remained the same. I was addressing the whole company now, every floor connected through screens. I wore dark, tailored trousers and a cream blouse. The same as the morning I had arrived. 1 year ago, I walked into this building and was told, publicly, that I would not last a week. A quiet moved through the room. I resigned because I refused to be made small. Not from fragility, but because accepting such treatment without consequence is precisely how it becomes normal. Rupert, seated in the audience, gave a small, quiet nod. I returned because consequence is not destruction, because this building holds people who deserve better leadership. I came back to make that better leadership real. I stepped back from the front of the room. My mother invested here for 16 years because she believed this company could be excellent. I believe exactly the same. Applause began slowly and built steadily. I did not take a bow. I stood in the room where they had tried to make me leave, and I let the moment settle. If you have stayed with this story to the very end, thank you. Which moment hit you hardest? The resignation? The conditions document? Or the afternoon Rupert finally sat down? Leave your answer in the comments, I read every one. And if this story meant something to you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it.